offer us explanations. And often if we are discussing the subject with somebody, they ask for explanations. It's not good enough to tell them to do something or to carry out a certain program. They actually want to know why they should do it. And consequently, whilst many of the topics I'll be discussing in this series of talks will be, to a great extent, theoretical, I've tried to introduce throughout certain practical considerations so that they are of actual practical benefit to people. Now, in hygiene we have always claimed that we have a definite scientific theory. That is to say, the theory is scientific because it can be tested. It can be refuted. You can actually put it to the test. There are so many theories that are offered to people that cannot be checked. They cannot be tested. It's impossible to refute them. You can't say whether they're right or wrong because there's no means, there's no criterion by which they can be tested. Consequently, those theories are not scientific. In hygiene, we have a positive system, which is, in essence, a scientific system, because it can be practically applied and checked and rechecked. In fact, every person who applies it carries out the experiment for themselves, and they do, as a result of this application, get certain results, or certain consequences follow the causes which they apply. Now, when we come to the consideration of the human body, or for that matter, any living organism, we are indeed at a loss to grasp the full impact of the complexity of living systems, the complex and intricate systems of physical and chemical changes that are constantly taking place within these living things is always a source of wonder. And we see in all living things, and I believe in nature itself, commensalism rather than parasitism. That is to say, we see cooperation rather than a sort of the old Huxley's idea of the law of the jungle. I prefer to think of nature as expressing the concept of cooperation, or symbiosis as biologists have termed it. And we see this to a very great extent at work in the living organism, the tremendous cooperation between the various systems, which are often, unfortunately, in science, studied as independent organs or independent systems. When we view the body as a hygienist, we see the body as a whole, functioning as a unit, and each organ, instead of being independent, is actually dependent for its survival on the cooperation and work of all the other organs and systems within the body. We cannot divide the body into watertight compartments, into isolated organs, study the function of these isolated organs, and attempt as a result to make an analysis of life. Only by the complete synthesis, or the bringing together of all these independent organs, can we see the total picture. And unfortunately, in specialization today in research, physiology and biology, the whole subject is becoming narrower and narrower until finally, in the actual practical science which evolves from this research in medicine, we find specialization to a degree where the patient is completely lost sight of, and the patient's problems are lost somewhere in the limbo of specialization, and the minute particles which are analysed and the various advices that are given to the patients are of very little practical value because they do not see the individual as a whole. Each organ then in the body is merely a part of a whole, and it must be considered always in its relation to the whole. The fact that a person can live with merely 2/5 of a liver may be remarkable, but nevertheless this must be related to its effect on the whole organism. The fact that the needs of the body can be supplied by a small part of one organ doesn't mean that the body can attain its full potential under this circumstance. There is certainly in medical science and in biological science generally, certainly in the literature that we receive, a great disparity between the inorganic world, or the world of inert matter, and the organic world, or the world of living things. And unfortunately, scientists have tended to interpret life purely in terms of physics and chemistry. And this makes the subject much more difficult for us to comprehend. It is certainly true that many of the principles of physics and chemistry are completely applicable in biology. And it's certainly true that in biology none of the laws of physics or chemistry are actually violated. But in biology we find there is something more than a mere physical or chemical principle involved. We see this, for instance, in the law of cause and effect, which is quite commonly known by people in the physical world, in physics and in chemistry, that like causes will always produce like effects. And as a general principle, this is true in biology, but not absolutely so. We do find that certain causes in one person will produce certain group of symptoms, whereas the same causes in another person will produce another group of symptoms. Dr. Pottinger demonstrated this quite clearly many years ago with his famous experiments on cats, where applying the same causes brought about a host of pathology from one group of animals to another. Therefore we see that in the living organism we have a variable to consider, something that is different from the various matters that are examined in physics and chemistry. We find that in the living organism, that each living organism is somewhat different in its ability to act under certain influences and under certain conditions. Consequently, the differences in the object or the living organism upon which causes are operating determine the differences which are manifested in disease. This is to say that whilst the causes will certainly produce effects, the effects vary because of the differences in the different human bodies upon which the cause is acting or is influencing. I don't know whether I'm making myself quite clear in this regard, but we know that, for instance, if a certain group of people are fed on a diet which is, say, particularly deficient in a specific nutrient, after a certain period of time, some people will manifest symptoms of deficiency. But not everybody will, or at least not in the same period of time. The reason for this, of course, is because of the individual variations, the difference in the nutritive reserves, the differences in the different person's ability to mobilize the reserves of the body and to make necessary adjustments. We know that some people are influenced much more by extremes of temperature, cold and heat, than others. This is because of the individual variations. So we must always bear this in mind, that it is not entirely correct to make an analogy between the world of the inorganic world, or the world of inert matter, and that of the living body, or the living organisms. Now, this problem is one that is often ignored in physiology, and many times in the literature I come across items which indicate that this mistake is being made. And there are many examples that I could quote from literature that I've come across in the last few weeks which have made this particular mistake. And consequently, it does lead to a great deal of confusion, and particularly confusion in the public mind. Now we can see here that if we have an inorganic or a non-living influence on a living thing, then there are a lot of variables involved. If we come to consider the two living organisms creating a certain amount of activity between themselves, the situation becomes even more complex. And this is what is involved where bacteria are concerned, because bacteria themselves are living organisms, and the host in which they reside is also a living organism, and therefore merely making comparisons between the chemistry of both is not sufficient. The whole nutrition of both has to be considered. However, this I hope to go into in more detail in my talk on the mechanisms and the genesis and development of disease. One of the most interesting statements concerning the human body was made by a famous physician many years ago, when he said that health and not disease is the mystery. And it is true that many people have devoted much or all of their lives to the study of the human body in disease, to the study of pathology, to the study of the mechanisms of disease, but in comparison very little work has been done, thank you, on the study of health. And it is true that health is more of a mystery than disease. In bacteriology, for instance, many suggestions have been made as to the causes of disease, that this specific organism has this specific influence and so on. But very rarely do bacteriologists attempt to explain why certain people are actually infected with certain bacteria. They are actually found in sites within the body which would usually be considered dangerous, and yet the person does not manifest any symptoms of infection. This is, of course, much more of a mystery than the actual activity that's involved when there is or are symptoms of infection. Unfortunately, this aspect of bacteriology has very rarely, if ever, been subjected to any experimental analysis. Why people don't become sick when they're subjected to influences which are commonly considered to make people sick is a very interesting avenue for research. And of course, whilst we as hygienists can usually offer a very satisfactory explanation as to why we don't become sick when subjected to these influences, most people are mystified. Similar to the school teacher up at Thimble who was mystified as to why my daughter was the only child in the class who didn't have measles just a few months ago. Now, quite obviously, we can offer an explanation. It may not be accepted, of course, but we believe we have an explanation for this. The mechanisms involved in disease are far more complex, and the mechanisms involved in maintaining health are far more complex than most of us could imagine, and certainly more complex than I could possibly explain to you. But it is my intention to just bring to the point of discussion some of the more interesting aspects of the living organism, so that we can have perhaps a little more confidence in our bodies when we do unfortunately happen to develop some sickness. I find that people have a tremendous amount of confidence in their bodies when they're well, and they make such unusual and inordinate and unreasonable demands upon it when they're in health. And yet they lose, or seem to lose, completely their confidence in it as soon as a few symptoms arise. It's often more important to have confidence in your bodies when you're sick than to have it when you are well. And it's often much more important to know your limitations when you're well than it is to know your potentials. Because often if you're trying to find your potentials, you're going to damage yourself. Whereas if you actually know your limitations, you're going to be certain to maintain the degree of efficiency and integrity which you at the present time possess. Now, there was quite a brilliant physiologist some years ago who wrote quite extensively on physiological subjects, and he wrote quite a number of popular books. This was Dr. Walter Kennan. Now, Dr. Kelly was the first one to make any outline of physiological balance or self-modifying or self-adjusting mechanism, which is always effective in the body. He was the first one to outline this mechanism, which he referred to as homeostasis. This merely means a self-adjusting or self-modifying mechanism which exists within the body. Now, homeostasis involves much more than the word itself implies. And homeostatic mechanisms are mechanisms which are within the body, inbuilt in the body, merely to maintain the physical and chemical balance within very narrow limits. We find that in the single-celled organisms, such as the amoeba and paramecium and so on, that these single-celled organisms exist, or they live, in a completely fluid medium. That is, they live in water. And they are not entirely passive, as many people think. They're extremely active in the water, searching for particles of food, excreting their waste into the water, and their respiration takes place per the medium of the fluid in which they live. Now, unfortunately for the multicellular animal or the human being, it's not particularly desirable to live in a fluid medium in the manner in which the single-celled organism does. It would be extremely difficult for us to conduct our lives continually underwater. In the way the organism is constructed, of course, it would now be impossible. But nevertheless, for all intents and purposes, the body does actually exist in a fluid medium. There's about 6 or 7 quarts of fluid upon which it depends for its very life and existence. If the body were broken into small fragments, it would probably require somewhere in the region of 53,000 gallons to maintain the life of the cells. But owing to these marvellous mechanisms involved in self-regulating and self-adjusting, which can be referred to as homeostatic mechanisms, owing to these, we can live with this 6 or 7 quarts of fluid. Many people have written on this entirely magnificent master drama which we call life, which of course is a total process known as nutrition, which involves processes of absorbing, utilizing, circulating and transporting nutrients to the cells, removing waste products, transporting these to the various organs which have been specially designed and adapted for the removal and excretion of waste. Now, it's interesting that the chemical balance of the body must be constant within certain very narrow limits all of the time for us to maintain our health, indeed for us to maintain our life. And there are many organs within the body whose function it is to see that this chemical balance is maintained. We refer to these organs commonly as vital organs: the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, and of course we must not forget the major directive system, the nervous system. All the organs and functions and systems of the body are under the control and the dominating influence of the nervous system. And when I refer to the nervous system, I'm thinking more of that complex autonomic nervous system rather than the nervous system known as the cerebrospinal nervous system, which is more connected with voluntary activities. But this vast and intricate network of nerves which comprises the autonomic nervous system is responsible for the coordination and the cooperation which exists between the various organs and systems of the body. And it has been pointed out many times before, and I too have reiterated it many times, that if it were possible to melt away all the tissues of the body and leave the nervous tissues intact, friends would be able to recognize the denuded subject. So perfect would be the physical outline of the body, which would be manifested by these nervous tissues. We can see there the complexity and the intricacy of this nervous system and how involved it is in maintaining this cooperation of function between the various organs and tissues of the body. Now, if we just briefly consider some of the items of function which are associated with this fluid medium in which we live, this internal fluid medium which is known as blood, lymph and tissue fluid. It has to, first of all, transport from the environment oxygen from the atmosphere to the actual cells. And this is indeed not a simple process. Oxygen can only be absorbed by the lungs under certain conditions of temperature and pressure. Here we see how important the laws of physics are in themselves, because here the laws of physics are applicable. The conditions of temperature and pressure must be right for this absorption of oxygen to take place. Then there is the problem, once we have the oxygen in the blood, the actual process of getting it to the cells, attaching it to the blood cells, is also a master drama of chemistry. But having loosely chemically associated the oxygen with the actual blood cells and transporting it through the blood vessels, there is also the problem of getting it from the blood vessels outside the vessels into the actual tissues. Now this is something that many people don't think about. The oxygen is transported within the blood into the body, but it has to be exchanged in the tissues for carbon dioxide. This too depends upon a very delicate chemical balance, maintaining a certain degree of acidity and alkalinity. I intend to discuss this important subject of the acid and alkali balance later, but the actual conditions of temperature and pressure which exist within the tissue are also responsible for the exchange of the gases at a tissue level. Now, the tissue exchange of gases, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide, can only take place in the very, very smallest capillary beds. These capillaries are so minute that the blood cells can only travel along the blood vessels not only in single file but also curled up. And the blood cell is extremely small. The actual red cells are somewhere in the region of about 7 millimicrons in size. And these are somewhat disc-shaped. And in order to travel through the capillaries, they have to actually curl up into form a minor tube. And only in this way can they travel. Here we can see a practical consideration of how it is possible for a thrombosis to develop. If the tendency of the blood vessels is to agglutinate, that is to clump together, owing to a change in the viscosity or the thickness or the chemistry generally of the blood. If this should occur, and of course overstep these limitations of chemistry which I have mentioned that must constantly exist within the body, if this tends to occur, then this blood vessel in which the agglutination takes place will become occluded or blocked. If this happens to be an important vessel, such as a coronary vessel in the heart, then the person has a mild or a severe, depending on how important the vessel is, a coronary thrombosis. These thromboses occur quite frequently in people, much more frequently than many people imagine. Various swellings and sorenesses that occur on the surface of the body can commonly be associated with thrombosis. Fortunately, of course, the vast majority that occur are never actually observed and the person doesn't know anything about them. The blood vessels in which they occur are not terribly important, they're not on the surface of the body, and therefore adjustments are made internally, and the lesion heals, and the person is not much the worse for it. It's interesting to note too in this connection that Dr. Cabell, a famous pathologist in Massachusetts, wrote quite extensively on pathology and theory of disease and so on. One time, an elderly gentleman was brought into the hospital who had recently suffered a motor accident. He died within an hour of being in the hospital, and this was an elderly man somewhere in the region of 75. Well, Dr. Cabell performed an autopsy on this man, and he found that in both lungs he had extensive tubercular lesions which had all healed. He had a great deal of liver destruction as a result of cirrhosis. Not only this, but great portions of the liver had been destroyed, and new blood vessels had actually been constructed by the body to circumvent those areas of liver which had been destroyed as a result of the processes of disease. Furthermore, he found that this man was functioning on about a third of one kidney, having destroyed as a result of chronic nephritis the remaining portions of his kidney. He had extensive indications of arterial sclerosis, that's hardening of the arteries, with a considerable amount of occlusions throughout his body in various areas. The arteries were completely destroyed and no longer functionally useful. Now, on questioning the relatives of this man, Dr. Cabell discovered that this man had never actually been really sick. He had often, of course, complained of minor pains like headaches and aches and pains that are considered in modern society as being quite normal, quite usual, quite common. But this man had never actually lost any time from work. He'd never been an invalid. And yet, Dr. Cabell's findings indicated that this man suffered 4 serious and potentially fatal diseases. And yet, somehow or other, the organism had managed to adjust itself and adapt itself in such a way as the man did not feel really ill. So you can well imagine the tremendous amount of destruction that has to take place in a person when they actually appear to be in a serious state from some chronic disease. And of course they usually come along and want to get well in 10 days to a fortnight. But the amount of damage that has been done to the tissues in, say, something like Bright's disease or tuberculosis or diabetes, arthritis, and many of the rheumatic complaints, the amount of destruction to tissue that has taken place often has to be seen to be believed, and it has to be compared microscopically with the normal before most people can realize the tremendous amount of damage that's been done. And in many cases, unfortunately, it is irreparable. But once again, fortunately, we know that even if damage is irreparable, the person can still be practically restored to health, from a practical point of view, that is. For instance, referring to this old gentleman who suffered these 4 potentially fatal diseases. For all practical purposes, he was a reasonably well man. His body had made such adjustments and adaptations that it was no longer a serious problem to it. The liver damage had been circumvented by new blood vessels, the tubercular lesions in the lungs had all healed, the arteries had been reconstructed in areas where the blood supply was inadequate, and his kidneys were managing to function, although enlarged, on the portion that was still remaining active. Anyway, this is in some respect something of a digression from when I was discussing the blood transport system, but it does bring out the important point of the body's ability to adapt itself and adjust itself to conditions which it can't escape or overcome. And the body is often meeting these demands. The body is constantly being put into circumstances which it would be better if it weren't subjected to. But it has to be subjected to these influences, emotional stresses, changes in temperature, continued and prolonged exposure to cold and so on, and of course the common ingestion of unwholesome foods, and too much food at too frequent intervals, inadequately masticated, and all of the other faulty eating habits that many people have. The body has to withstand these influences because it has no possible means of escape. These adjustments are commonly taking place, for instance, in the lungs and the mucous membranes in the person who is an habitual smoker. The first time a person smokes, the body makes a most vigorous defense against the habit. There's coughing, often feeling of nausea, sometimes vomiting. There's commonly headache. The person, the normal senses are repulsed by the habit. And the body indicates in a most unmistakable manner that it doesn't want the tobacco, that it doesn't want the nicotine, that it cannot use it. But unfortunately the person insists on having the cigarettes, they persist with the habit, the body is subjected to this influence which it cannot escape and it cannot overcome. So it has to make adjustments. It has to adapt itself to a circumstance which it can't get away from. And in so doing, the mucous membranes, they thicken. The blood vessels, which are close to the surface of the lung, also thicken. Circulatory modifications take place in which small capillaries are cut off. And by these means, the body manages to stay alive in the face of certain poisons and habits which it would be better if it weren't subjected to. And thus life carries on in spite of its enemies. The blood transport system of the body, which involves not only the blood itself but also the tissue fluids and the lymphs, is also important in its conducting of nutrients. Now, nutrients, of course, we all know what nutrients are. Those, the end products of the food that we eat. Those substances that are ingested and absorbed into the body to provide nourishment. Now, most of us here, no doubt, are extremely careful about what we put into our bodies, because we realize that the body can only construct vigorous, sound, healthy tissues if we provide it with the materials for doing this job. If we provide it with inferior materials, obviously the job that it performs in reconstruction and maintenance must also be inferior. All of these nutrients, once they have been adequately digested, and of course digestion is itself a marvel of chemistry, but all of these nutrients have to be transported to the various organs and tissues of the body. Each tissue selecting the particular nutrient that it requires. We know that certain nutrients are required in greater amounts by some tissues than by others. That the brain requires certain elements in a greater quantity than other tissues, for instance phosphorus. So people think that they're going to become geniuses if they eat plenty of fish because it contains phosphorus. Unfortunately, nutrition doesn't work quite like this. We know that iron is needed by the blood, also by the liver. We know that certain vitamins are stored in certain areas, particularly in the liver and in the bone marrow, and that these constitute considerable reserves of these vitamins, which are readily available if the person has to go on a fast. These reserves can last for a considerable period if food is not available or it cannot be used owing to some disturbance of the alimentary canal. The various products of cellular activity, the actual processes of life, produce waste products, which if allowed to accumulate in the body gradually poisoning it until death results. These have to be removed. In the healthy person, of course, they are removed just as rapidly as they are produced. They're removed into the tissue fluids, then into the blood. These are transported then to the various depurative organs, the liver, the kidneys, the lungs, and to a very much lesser extent, the skin. The skin, of course, is complex in its structure, much more complex than many people think, and has many functions apart from its merely protective and sweating functions. The maintenance of the water balance of the body is also extremely important, and this brings us to a consideration of the acid and alkali balance. Now, no doubt all of us have read of acid-forming foods and alkaline-forming foods and so on, and unfortunately many people tend to be confused by this because it does involve a little chemistry and a little understanding of chemical principles. And many people cannot quite understand why certain foods which are apparently acid are actually alkaline forming within the body. And this does provide for them something of a mystery. Why acid fruits are actually alkaline when they're metabolized within the body, and why certain foods which appear to be bases result in an acid waste which is undesirable. Now we might say first of all that it is not possible to exist completely without some acid-forming food. Nor, of course, is it desirable. Acids must be produced within the body. So there is no need to fear acid-forming foods. It's merely a matter of getting the correct balance. There is no need to fear the production of acids within the body either, because this is quite normal, and under normal circumstances the body can cope with these acids quite easily, providing that the alkaline reserve is adequate, which of course in the healthy person it is. A system of designating acid and alkali has been devised, which is known by the symbol pH. A substance which is strongly acid ranges from pH 1 to the lesser acid up to neutral pH 7, and then from pH 7 through to pH 14 are the alkaline substances. pH 14 of course being extremely caustic, a very strong alkali. The pH of the blood and the tissue fluids must remain fairly constant between pH 7.35 and 7.45. You can see from that that it's an extremely delicate balance, and that if the blood or the fluids of the body should go outside of those limits, then symptoms would immediately appear. If the pH extends very much outside those limits, of course, death will result. Local changes, of course, are commonly occurring, but the general change towards an excess on either side would result in serious consequences. We see then that the tissues of the body are slightly alkaline. They're almost neutral, but they are slightly alkaline, and that has to be maintained. And it's maintained by a very, very complex system of substances which are known as buffers, chemical buffers. That means that if the system tends to become too acid, or a considerable quantity of acid develops within the body, these substances, these buffer substances, have an effect of neutralizing this and acting as alkaline substances. If, on the other hand, a considerable amount of an alkaline substance comes into the body, which tends to throw the balance the other way, these substances can then act as acids. The amino acids of the body, which are associated with the end result of protein digestion, which are formed of a pool within the body, which the body is drawing on all the time to rebuild its tissues, these amino acids are excellent examples of this buffer system, in that they are what is chemically known as amphoteric. That is, that they can act as either alkaline elements or acid elements. They can go either way depending upon the needs of the body. And the body is constantly making use of these substances in order to maintain this alkaline acid balance, which is extremely important to all the functions of the body. If it gets too much towards the acid side, then we have so many important changes taking place within the body that it becomes undesirable. You can often spot this particular type of person as being extremely nervous. Nervous symptoms are extremely prevalent at this stage. As a matter of fact, there's a digression here. There was an excellent indication of this quite recently when I was called out to a gentleman who had been fasting on his own at home following some book, which of course I don't recommend, even if the book's my own. And he'd been fasting for 50 days. And during this time, of course, he considerably enervated himself by taking as many as 3 enemas a day. He'd been thoroughly chilled at intervals, lying in bed in the small hours of the morning, shivering for hours. Well, by the time I reached him, the nervous state that he was in, you can possibly imagine. He lost his pupil reflex. The pulse was almost inaudible. The blood pressure was down to about 55, systolic blood pressure, which is normally around about the 100 region. And the man was almost delirious and almost comatose. Well, here we see an effect of an acid build-up within the body. Elimination had been checked, he'd been thoroughly chilled at intervals, he'd been enervating himself as a result of various treatments that he read were desirable in the book. But of course, the book didn't necessarily indicate that these things should be done after 50 days of fasting. But nevertheless, this was the interpretation that he made, and this, of course, was unfortunately the situation in which he found himself. But nevertheless, this is an extreme indication, but we do find some of these symptoms, to a mild extent, appearing in people who are living under conventional conditions in a highly nervous state, and their activities are quite abnormal because of this reduced alkaline balance, which is evident within the body. Body temperature is also something that's extremely important as a circulatory measure. We know that the body's temperature can fluctuate quite considerably from about 94, 95 degrees Fahrenheit through to about 106, or in very rare instances up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And activity, or the actual cellular activity, or metabolic activity as it's called, varies almost directly with the change in temperature. The lower the temperature, the more reduced the activity. This is only a generalization, of course, because even in low temperatures, certain activities within the body may be accelerated. But generally speaking, metabolism is slowed down by low temperature and accelerated by a higher temperature. That's why we see the complete change in the metabolic processes in fevers. If a young child, or even an adult for that matter, but young children are more common in the expression of fevers than adults. We see a fever of about 104 or 105. We see a tremendously increased heart rate. The pulse is full and rapid. The respiration is often rapid and maybe deeper, it may be shallow depending upon the circumstances, commonly shallow. And we see that there is always a relationship in the ratio between heartbeat, pulse, respiration and body temperature. There's also always a distinct ratio. Now, this is also an indication for the diagnostician, for those of us who are practitioners. If we see a departure from the normal ratio between, say, the temperature and the pulse rate, then we know that something serious is developing. But if the normal ratio is maintained, then we have very little to worry about. But we know that people who often die as a result of tri-season pneumonia during the fever, there is always, before the end, a departure from the normal ratio between the pulse rate, the respiration, and the body temperature. And this gives us an important indication of the seriousness of the case. Well, it's the work of the body to completely maintain this normality. We see in fever that the skin is dry and hot, that the blood vessels in the surface of the body are suffused with blood, that the vital organs, internal organs, the muscles, and the digestive organs particularly, tend to be somewhat deprived of blood. That, of course, is why in all these feverish conditions, if we go through the various so-called diseases, typhoid fever, typhus, poliomyelitis, influenza, smallpox, measles or scarlatina, any of these, we find that one of the first symptoms to manifest is anorexia or loss of appetite. This, of course, is for the reason that the blood is withdrawn from the digestive apparatus and is concerned with the acceleration of the metabolic process and the dissipation of heat which the accelerated metabolic process produces. And the dissipation of heat through the skin becomes dry and hot, and the blood vessels are suffused with blood because it is withdrawn from the internal organs. We can see there that it's rather important that the person under these circumstances should not be fed, because once we take food into our bodies, the digestive organs themselves become suffused with blood. Blood is sent to the digestive organs to digest the food. It's an absolute indispensable need under those circumstances. And if we take food under these conditions, we are actually working against the body's best interest. We are not providing the body with the needs that it is indicating through the foul breath, the coated tongue, the loss of appetite, and the general feeling of not wanting food. But body temperature regulation is extremely important, and many efforts are made often where fevers are concerned to reduce the temperature. We generally feel that this is, as a generalization, a mistake, and that if fever develops as a result of an internal necessity, then it should be understood and the body's needs be provided so that the temperature can be regulated according to the needs of the body. If we suddenly reduce it, we're interfering with this important mechanism. When the time comes, when the actual accelerated processes of metabolism have completed the work, when the waste has been eliminated, when the various toxins have been oxidized and dealt with satisfactorily, and the liver has handled them, at this time the fever will break. And of course we all know what that means. That means that the sweat glands immediately become active, and instead of the skin being dry and hot, rather profuse perspiration takes place, and within a few hours the temperature starts to drop. So this, of course, is the normal pattern that a fever should take. And if the needs of the body are supplied and the person is given the proper conditions, then this will automatically follow. But at the time, although we must recognize this fever as a beneficial process, it is also an expensive process so far as the body is concerned. And whilst we may argue that disease or the symptoms of disease we may represent remedial efforts on the part of the body, that they are attempts on the part of the body to restore normality, we must also realize that whilst they are restorative processes, they are not always successful. And as we well know, people do sometimes die. But that doesn't mean to say that the actual process was dangerous or that it was wrong. It was just the body was unsuccessful in its remedial effort. Now the fever is not in itself dangerous. People have often said that fever is dangerous and it must be brought down, and of course the modern treatment, perhaps not quite so modern now, was to bring the fever down and bring it down quickly. Medicine has to some extent modified its views on fever now, and they're not so anxious to reduce it. But nevertheless, if we can see that this process is a remedial effort, that it is a beneficial process essentially, although it may not necessarily be successful, that is still its important function. We must not make any attempt to actually interfere with it in an effort to actually suppress it. On the other hand, if the fever is brought about not by a spontaneous generation from within, but as a result of, say, heat stroke or something like this, this represents, of course, a different problem. The temperature regulation of the body was also brought to our notice quite recently. I was reading an article in the paper concerning the making of this film in London. Goldfinger, one of Ian Fleming's novels, has recently been made into a film. And one of the actresses in the film had to be painted with gold paint all over. Now this represented a very serious threat to her health and well-being. Now years ago it used to be thought that the reason the person was in danger under this circumstance was because elimination through the skin was checked. But of course we know now that this is not true, and that it is because it interferes with the heat regulation of the body, and that there is no actual danger providing the temperature of the body remains constant under these circumstances. The experiments were first, of course, as usual, conducted in laboratories with rats and guinea pigs who were had their fur shaved off and were painted with all different varieties of metallic paints and varnishes and so on. They found that they could be kept alive if their temperature was maintained. But usually the painting of the body, like in this instance of the actress with gold paint, increases the dissipation of heat from the body, but it loses the heat so rapidly that the person's life is in danger. So one of the most important homeostatic mechanisms within the body is this regulation of temperature. It's important also to know that the temperature of the body can't go too high. Many people become frightened when they see a child who is feverish, and they think that the temperature will just go up and up and up until finally something blows up. In some sense they think it might be chemical and that the person can more or less just burn away. It is of course true that under these circumstances the person loses weight much more rapidly than at normal temperatures. And I've seen patients in fever, young children, and it almost appears that their weight is falling off them because you can see a change in just a few hours from the weight point of view. But there is an actual control, a metabolic control within the cell which will prevent the temperature from going too high. Because certain processes, all processes actually within the body are regulated by chemical substances which are a form of catalysts which are known as enzymes. Now these enzymes, although they don't actually take part in the chemical changes, they do regulate the chemical changes. And in the 1500 to 2000 chemical changes that take place in every cell each minute of our lives, these processes are regulated by some 100,000 different enzymes. Now these enzymes are only active at certain temperatures, and you find that most of them are inactivated when the temperature gets up around 105 to 110. So consequently we can see that if the fever does go very high, there is an automatic check on it going too high, because these enzymes which regulate the processes are no longer active and the temperature must fall, because the temperature is in the first place generated by this cellular activity. If it becomes too intense, then it slows down and the temperature falls. So there is an automatic check upon the height to which fevers can go. Apart from the oxygen, nutrition, excretion, body temperature regulation which exists as a result of the mechanisms involved in circulation and the fluid distribution of the body, there is also the marvellous protective mechanisms which it has. And of course the body is constantly protected from poisons generated within itself and the poisons which may enter from without. We witness, for instance, if we happen to drive a splinter into the skin, how the inflammation occurs, the delicate changes that take place, the formation of pus, the way in which the body is able to extrude the splinter, and the way in which healing takes place. This in itself is a miracle. But the blood does contain, within the fluid, various substances which are constantly detoxifying various poisons which may get into the body from the digestive tract. They may be generated within the body. They may be absorbed from various processes in the body which are pathological, such as boils and abscesses and tuberculous lesions and various other inflammatory and non-inflammatory processes which may develop as a result of disease. The body makes tremendous efforts to localize these things and prevent any danger from arising. We see even in acute appendicitis, where the appendix may become abscessed and even rupture, where the body is able to build a wall of fibrous tissue around the appendix in order to contain the abscessed material and prevent the spread of the inflammation into the peritoneal cavity, which of course is extremely dangerous. Many surgeons have written on this, that when they have operated they have found a little fibrous sac around the appendix which has prevented the spread of the so-called infection. And of course we know from our own experience that in cases of acute appendicitis that in many cases have been known to recover and been restored to very good health without the application of the knife. Yours truly being one of these people. Well, the homeostatic mechanism within the body then not only involves regulation of temperature, control of nutrients, regulation of and distribution of oxygen, and the general domination of the chemical processes of the body, it also maintains, generally speaking, that narrow and confined limit of chemical and physiological balance, which is absolutely indispensable to maintain life. We know of the regulation of the body's functions that has to take place when we subject ourselves to exercise. How more blood is drawn away from places like the digestive tract, and the heart receives a greater amount of blood. The muscles receive a considerable quantity of blood. There is increased activity of the endocrine glands to meet the greater demand for energy. There is increase in respiration. The heart's output, as well as its rate, is accelerated. This is all an adjustment to meet the changing circumstances. We know how the pulse rate changes immediately we get up from a lying position to a standing position. We know how the changes in blood pressure take place immediately from getting from a lying position to a standing position. All of this, of course, is accomplished instantaneously. We're not even aware of it, and yet all of these changes have to take place, otherwise we get symptoms immediately. In various disease processes we observe certain changes which, as I have mentioned in relation to Dr. Cabot's experiences, are absolutely essential to maintain life, like the enlargement of kidneys, the enlargement of the liver, the walling off of various lesions such as tuberculosis, and the various adaptations that take place in, say, paralysis, the adaptations that take place in various other serious nervous diseases of the body. For instance, in poliomyelitis, it has been known as a result of education and re-education of muscular systems that people with poliomyelitis who have been paralyzed from this and other nervous diseases have been able to use certain muscles as a result of generating activity along other nerve pathways. Certain nerves have been destroyed, and as a result of careful education, the person has been able to use these muscles because other nerves have taken over the job of the destroyed ones. And this is just something of the wonder of the human body. So I think that when we come to consider it in health or disease, we must agree that it is a marvellous mechanism. We should have more respect for it, and when we understand its delicate operation, its complexity, and the marvellous job it does for us, we should care for it with a considerable degree of sagacity and thoughtfulness. Thank you.